Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue on our discussion with a variety of mental health issues as they pertain to fiction and how to portray them in fiction, that sort of thing. And I guess we're kind of on a theme with the sort of sad issues. We did depression, and then we did suicide. And today what I'm going to do is talk about grief. Grief is a tricky topic to talk about in the context of mental health. Well, first let me say, I'm not really a grief counselor. I don't really specialize in this, but it comes up a lot. And a piece of advice that one of my old instructors gave to us new up-and-coming counselors, and I agree with this, and I actually pass it on to a lot of my associates, my interns, when they're working on, is every counselor needs to be at least familiar with three issues. One is child abuse, because it's very common, chemical dependency, and grief. Child abuse, chemical dependency, and grief. Those three topics will at some point or in some way touch almost every client that you work with. People were either abused as children or saw abuse happen, and abuse is a very broad topic, and we may make that a part of one of these other later videos, and it'll probably be a multi-variant kind of issue. Chemical dependency, same thing. Either the client is an addict, or they were raised by addicts, or there was an addict in the family, or they're in a relationship with an addict. But in some way, chemical dependency has touched most clients' lives as well. And then grief is one of those topics that can come up at any time. And it's happened to me before where I'm working with a client, and what they're coming in to see me for is they're just unhappy in their job, and they don't really know what they want to do with their lives. And it's sort of existential kind of discussion. And then one day, their grandmother gets really sick and dies. And it's rather unexpected. Or they even have to have their cat put down or something else like that. So all of a sudden, I'm a grief counselor, even though this is not really something I specialize in, because grief can come up in many different ways. And the reason why I say it's difficult to talk about in a mental health issue, mental illness kind of issue, is I don't really think of grief as a mental illness. Grief is, and this is my sort of definition of it, grief is the acknowledgement of the loss of something, the emotions that come up with the loss of something. Now, typically when you hear grief, we're usually talking about the loss of a person. Like I just used the example of a grandmother or a cat or a pet or a friend or something else like that. But really, grief can be any kind of loss. And that's usually the context I see it coming up in the most. Someone who going through a divorce, that's a loss. They were married and now they're not. And there's an adjustment to that. But even the loss can be kind of positive as well. A young couple gets married. In a way, they kind of have to mourn their single life. And certainly when the kids come, they have to kind of mourn the fact that they aren't really free-willing and able to do everything that they want to do anymore. Just losing, sleep, losing the ability to just kind of go out and do whatever they want. Women, I think, sometimes need to mourn the loss of their bodies. Having a baby can change a woman's body, and so the way she looks at 25 with no kids is going to be very different than 35 after a couple of kids. And so, losing a job, losing a career, graduating from high school, going off to college, graduating from college. I definitely mourned the loss of college because I really liked college. I really kind of blossomed and grew during that time period, and never ever been able to really kind of recapture that time. So it was like 4.5 years. It was very special to me. And so when we look at grief through that lens, you see that there's lots and lots of ways that people can grieve. But the reason why I say it is natural and normal is because it is basically this sort of acknowledgement that something has changed fundamentally and in a way that probably won't ever come back, most likely. And again, it's like the death of a person. When grandma dies, that's it. She's gone, and she's never coming back, and there's no negotiating it or getting around it or any of those sort of things. We talk about the 5 stages of grief, which they're not horrible, but I don't really prescribe to it. But even like I said, when I graduated from college, that was a loss. I went to grad school again twice, but it was never the same. It was never the same as in my late teens, early 20s, going off for the first time and really having no responsibilities. It's like kindergarten for adults. It's fun, and so to me, I don't like the idea of pathologizing grief. And the new DSM manual, it's one of the things that they did was that they kind of pathologized grief. It's basically kind of says that there's something wrong if you are grieving. And I don't think there's anything wrong with grieving. In fact, I think it is more unhealthy to not grieve. And I do see that sometimes with some of my clients that they are stuck. And I think that's really my job as the counselor, is to make sure that they move through the grieving process, that they don't stay stuck, either staying stuck to where they will not let go of their grief and they, for whatever reason, or that they refuse to grieve at all and they just want to pretend like it's all okay and it's no big deal and just sweep it all under the rug and move on with life. And I think that's probably, from a fiction standpoint, that is probably where interesting stories come from. And there's lots of different stories. I think I talked about this before. I watched a movie with my dad over Christmas break about this cowboy who drank heavily and fell in love and got sober, and it came out that the reason why he drank so heavily was because he was driving the car and fell asleep at the wheel when the accident happened, and his wife and son died or something like that. And so he was stuck in his grief because he refused to let go of it for whatever reason. And that's always the more complicated thing, is why are people stuck with their grief? And there's a variety of reasons. One is this feeling that if I get through the grieving process, then I will just forget about them and I won't care, and it'll be like they never happened, and they're too important to me to let that happen. That's not what the grieving process looks like, but some people think that that's what it means. To me, the grieving process ends when someone can remember what they've lost or the person that they've lost, and it doesn't hurt anymore. That they can kind of acknowledge it, they can maybe even laugh about it, they feel good about it. They take all the positive memories and they hold on to that, and they just kind of let go of all the negatives that sort of come with it. And so grief is still about remembering people. It's just about remembering them in a way that doesn't really hurt us anymore. And so this cowboy in the story, he was holding on to his grief. Now, the story didn't really go into why. I think it was just they sort of put out there as like, well, it's just obvious. But I mean, was he feeling guilty? Because that's another reason. That would be a very good one in this case. Of he felt guilty, and so he felt like he didn't deserve to move on. And so he deserved to punish himself. He deserved to live in misery, and he deserved to drink himself to death. He deserved to lose his jobs, lose his friends, be cut off from everybody who might love him. And so you can kind of see where that goes. If someone feels like they have some kind of responsibility for the loss, particularly the death of a person, then they might feel like, well, I need to be punished in some way. And society said, I'm not to blame, but I know different, and so I'm going to punish myself forever and ever and ever. And so that's an interesting story, and I think it would have been more interesting for that story if they had gone down that road of exactly why did he hold on to his grief and why did he drink so much, and then how did he overcome that. So yeah, grief can be about guilt and shame. It can be about wanting to hold on forever and never let go. I think the other thing to talk about grief, which can be interesting, is everybody grieves differently. Everybody moves through the process a little faster. And they might get stuck on certain parts at different times. And one of the leading causes of divorce is between parents of a child that has died. And I think part of it is because the parents grieve differently, and they blame each other for not grieving right. the right way. And that's another thing. There's no right way to grieve. As long as you're moving through the process and working towards that end goal of remembering without hurting, then you're grieving right, if you need to do it a right way. But when they're stuck in their grief, there's sometimes a lot of blame and a lot of shame. A classic case, you'll see this a lot in a lot of fiction and that sort of thing, of like the one parent who won't let go and the other parent who kind of either wants to let go or really just doesn't even want to think about it anymore. They're kind of like rejecting the whole grieving process, and the other one's stuck in it. And so the one that's stuck in it, like, they might refuse to clean out the kid's room. They may go in there and sit, play with their toys, or talk to them, or constantly point out, like, oh, he would have been 12 years old today. He might be learning how to drive a car by now. He'd be, that sort of thing. Whereas the other parent just really kind of wants to move on, or maybe they want to ignore everything. They find that all that stuff is unhealthy, and so a lot of times people start to blame each other for not grieving in the right way. And so that can also be a good source of stories, is how do people deal with grief, and how do they deal with people not grieving in the same way or at the same rate, moving through the process at the same rate. And then we get into the other step of, like, if someone is stuck in the grieving process, then how do they manage those difficult emotions? Because it's unpleasant to be stuck in that state. Now, in the story of the cowboy, what he did is he drank a lot. Other people could be angry all the time. Remember, depression can manifest as anger. And that's another thing, is when you're stuck in the grieving process, you're now in depression. That's why I tell all my clients when they're grieving, is I tell them my job as the counselor is to make sure that your normal, healthy grief doesn't turn into depression. I need to nudge you along as gently but firmly as I can down the grieving process, so you don't stay stuck. And so when people are stuck, they are depressed, and then we go back to all the issues that come with depression that kind of come out of, like, how do you manage that? Substances is a big one. Isolating is a big one. Any sort of distraction, staying busy, working all the time, a workaholic, sex, porn, video games, anything that kind of will let you just sort of disconnect for a long period of time. Just basically not feel your feelings, which of course has the sort of thing that you're not feeling your feelings, so you're not actually moving through the process, and you stay stuck, and that it creates this vicious feedback loop. And so if you want to write characters that are grieving, I think, one, you need to be very specific about what they lost, and then how that loss can never come back again. That's why a person dying is one of the easier ones, because we all accept that when someone's dead, they're gone forever. But it can be other things too. Like I said, graduating from college, why can you never go back to that? So that's a common one of, like, you have to think about, like, what did they lose, and then how is that loss permanent, and then how that loss kind of impacted other aspects of their life. Their grandmother died, and they really loved their grandmother, and they didn't talk to her very much, and so they're kind of guilty about that, because maybe they should have talked to her more, because they found her to be such a great source of wisdom. Maybe their grandmother raised them partly because their mom was, alcoholic and dad was gone, or whatever else, And so when grandma is gone, she's never going to come back because she died, and therefore that there's a sense of stability, sense of continuity in life. A piece of immortality dies. That's something that a long time ago someone pointed out, was that at some psychological level, our parents, and by extension our grandparents, but certainly our parents, are immortal. Our parents have always been in our lives. I'm 52 years old. Both of my parents are still alive, and they have always been in my life. I've never experienced a world without my mother and my father in it. And one day I will probably have to. My guess is, they will probably go before I do, and I will have to experience that world in which they don't exist. And that alone is kind of like a little piece of immortality that's gone. The world will be a fundamentally different place for me because of that. And a lot of times we can't really predict how that will affect us. I've heard stories of people who they were raised by horribly abusive parents. They hated their parents. They didn't talk to their parents in years. But when they died, it still affected them because some part of their history, some part of their world was gone and will never come back again. And so that's another aspect. And so it's that sort of, what was the loss? How is that loss permanent? How does that loss affect other aspects of their lives? And then if we're talking about not moving through the grieving process, then we have to talk about, like, what are they doing to mitigate all of those negative emotions that come from not moving through the grieving process. And then that right there, well, that's your character motivation, that's a little bit of their history, and that kind of gives you a context of almost everything that they'll do throughout the story. And then, of course, the great thing with fiction is the conflict becomes this sort of internal conflict of, can they resolve this issue? Can they finally move on, make peace with their loss, however you like to describe it? And then how does that change their lives? You know, because the loss is still there and it's still permanent. It's not going to come back. That's why I kind of think like someone's ghost coming back and saying, "I love you, honey. You know, let me go." That's a little bit cheating. You know, that's the person who came back and sent a message, which, you know, I get it in paranormal stories, fantasy, maybe even some sci-fi. You know, it makes sense in the context, but really from a writing standpoint, that's kind of cheap. That's sort of like it was all just a dream kind of thing, right? You know, no work has to be really done by the character at that stage. So I think that's kind of cheapens the process, but I think it's one that comes up quite a bit. But yeah, that's sort of the end goal of that character arc is, how did they resolve their grief to the point that they can remember where it doesn't hurt anymore, and then how does that impact their lives? You know, in the movie that I saw with the cowboy, he was able to let go of his grief, or let go of his guilt over being the driver when his family was killed, and then that immediately meant that he could get sober and truly love this new woman. It was really more of a romance, and I think that's why they didn't go too deep into the grief, is they're kind of hitting more of the romantic angle of things. And so yeah, that's the things to consider if you want to talk about grief. It's a very fascinating process, and it's also one of those universal sort of universal experiences in the human experience. Like I said, everybody will experience grief in some way at some point in their life. Even if you've never had anyone close to you die, you've still experienced grief just by simply growing into adulthood, you know, or if you happen to be a teenager. Even growing to be a teenager, there's a certain loss that comes from being 16 versus 6, you know, and so everyone experiences grief. And so I think that's one of those universal concepts that can fit really in almost any story, any genre, any time period, because it just comes up all the time. Not everyone is anxious. Not everyone is depressed. Most people aren't suicidal. So not everyone will be able to relate to those concepts. But grief, yeah, you stick grief in a story and you will have a chunk of your readers that will immediately be able to connect with that reader and that plot line and that character development. So it's definitely something kind of worth thinking about, and kind of thinking about within your own life of in what loss have you experienced. If you feel like sharing in the comments, this would be a good comment sort of thing. You know, what loss have you experienced that is permanent, you can't get back, and that maybe still affects you to this day? And then how have you, or how could you learn to move through that process so that way remembering doesn't hurt so much, you know? But anyway, I think that's about all I got for the day. Next week we're going to switch it up. We're going to talk about anxiety and yeah, if you have any other ideas for topics you want to discuss, put them in the comments. I'll try and come up around them. I've got a lot of ideas to go along with this. I think we're probably also going to talk about trauma, substance abuse, maybe a little bit of eating disorders, talk about anxiety, and psychosis. So yeah, so I got a lot coming up in this series. But if you got an interest in something, post it in the comments, and I'll maybe bump it ahead of the line. But anyway, I will talk to you later. Bye.